This is Law Bytes, a podcast with Michael Geist.
It was meant to improve lives, but has it done more harm than good? More than $300,000 has been paid to Aboriginal artists during the first 18 months of the National Resale Royalty Scheme. It's designed so artists get a cut when their work is resold. But dealers and galleries say it's difficult to administer and is damaging the art trade.
The creation of an artist's resale right, also referred to as an artist resale royalty, has been adopted in many countries to at best mixed reviews. They're unsurprisingly widely supported by potential beneficiaries, but the data on who actually benefits raises real questions about the wisdom of the policy. Now, Canada may be headed in the same direction, as the government recently announced in its budget plans to introduce the measure. Professor Guy Rubb is the Vincent J. Marella Professor of Law at Temple University's Beasley School of Law and an expert in the intersection between intellectual property law, commercial law, the arts, and economic theory. Professor Rubb has written critically about the artist's resale right, including as part of a submission to a House of Commons committee that studied the issue several years ago. He joins me on the podcast to discuss the policy measure and its drawbacks, including his view that it primarily benefits artists, in his words, who are either wealthy, old, or dead. Guy, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining. You know, the Canadian government recently used its latest budget to announce plans to introduce a new artist resale right into Canadian copyright law. It isn't the first time the government made such a policy promise. It frankly said just as much last year. This year, it noted, and I'll quote just to provide people with the context, artists, particularly visual artists, are great contributors to Canada's cultural scene and among the lowest income earners in Canada despite their significant cultural contributions. An artist resale right provides the creators of original visual artwork with a royalty whenever their work is resold through an eligible sale, providing an additional income stream. Now, framed like that, few, I think, would oppose the change, yet you're someone that has studied this issue for many years and I think on a principled basis raised some real concerns. Why don't we start with the basics then? What is an artist resale right, or ARR?
So, as you said, ARR is artist resale royalties or resale rights. So right now, when a work of art is initially sold, the artists get paid. They usually get a big chunk of that payment. However, when the work is being resold, so along the market, second time, third time, the artist gets nothing. The income from the resale goes to whoever owns the art at that time. ARR changes that. ARR says that a certain percentage, let's say 5% of the purchase price, would be paid directly to the artist and not to whoever owns that piece of art right now. I think we'll touch on it later. The schemes are slightly more complicated than that, and they are limited to certain kind of sale in certain situations. But when they do apply, that's how they work. Certain percentage of the sale will go to the artist and not to the owner of that piece of art.
Okay, so who's implemented this? Canada's thinking about it, or has said that they're going to go ahead with it. I know that some other countries have gone ahead and done it. What are some of those countries, and what are some of the typical terms that are found in those pieces of legislation?
So actually, there are quite a few countries that implement that. I don't have the exact number, but it's over 70. The leaders here are definitely the European Union countries. This idea started in France in 1920. So the entire European Union has to apply it. All the European Union countries have to apply it, and various countries around the world, like Australia. That being said, the two biggest art markets in the world, or two of the biggest, the UK might be one of the three, but certainly the biggest one is the United States, and one of the three biggest one is China. Those two countries do not have resale royalties, and I don't think are about to implement those anytime soon. Although the United States every decade or so, the idea pops up and it never goes through. The schemes do vary from one country to another. Uh, Practically all of them apply to auction houses, but the question is what other institutions should be included. And some said only auction houses, the Sotheby's, the Christie's of the world. Some implemented to galleries, some implemented even more broadly. There's also always a money threshold. Small sales do not count. So how big should the sale be in order to count varies. Some countries has a few $100s, some country over 1,000, some country a few thousand. So the threshold, and some also has a cap. So some countries for really, really big art, you're not supposed to pay more than 30 or $40,000 for it. There's also some differences, some nuances in how the money is being collected and how it's being distributed. It's always some central authority or several of those that are going to sort of channel all those funds from those auction houses eventually to the artist. But I think the biggest variation is on those what kind of sales count, both in where they are carried out, um, auction house, galleries, or other institution, and how big the sales should be in order to be subject to the duty to pay royalties.
Okay. So what's notable there is that what matters in terms of the application of the domestic law, it sounds like, is the location of the sale or whoever happens to be engaged in the sale, not the nationality or the residency of the artist or the purchaser. It is simply where does the transaction technically take place. If it happens to be the intermediary or the platform facilitating the sale is located in the jurisdiction, that's what may trigger this legislation.
Yes, that's usually how it works.
Okay.
So
All right.
it's the location of the sale.
Okay. I mean that's notable, and perhaps we'll come to it. That's notable when you say
Yeah,
that the United States doesn't have these rules, Canada does, and so
yeah,
even if you had a Canadian rule, presumably that means that sales
yeah.
involving Canadian visual art, this kind of artwork, even with Canadians on both ends, if it took place in the United States, I assume that would mean that this wouldn't apply. The AR wouldn't apply in that context.
I think it depends how. I mean, I'm not an expert on Canadian constitutional law and long arm laws. Uh, I would imagine that Canada can write a statute that implements it to Canadian artists everywhere, but it would be unusual. I would say that would be unusual. There is no, as far as I know, there's no legislation on the table, so we can't actually see what is proposed. But it would be slightly unusual to apply a sale by a Canadian artist in the United States.
That's helpful to understand some of the basics. Now, you've made the case both in some of the academic literature and in a submission that you co-wrote a number of years ago with University of Toronto Professor Ariel Katz as part of a House of Commons study that looked at the risks and downsides associated with ARR. Now, when looking back at that submission, you first made the point that this, in some ways, isn't really copyright at all. I mean, we're talking about about this in the context of copyright, and that's certainly how the government has framed it. But you make the case this is really about tangible property. Can you explain the distinction between copyright and tangible property and why you think it matters?
Yeah, I mean, copyright generally is an area of the law that deals with intangible rights and not with physical property rights. So if I'm an author and I sell you a book that I wrote, I have control over the story. So you can't just go and sell the movie rights to my story to someone else. So that's control of the intangible. But I don't control the physical object. You want to put that book on your shelf, you want to put it in your car, you want to burn it, heaven forbid, you want to give it away, you want to throw it out. The book is not mine. The book is now yours. Once you purchase the physical object, copyright law, for the most part, has nothing to say about that. Other areas of the law, like physical property, might have something to say about that. Now, ARR is nothing to do with the intangible rights. Visual artists still control that. So think about Andy Warhol. He created all those images of Marilyn Monroe. The Andy Warhol Foundation still makes a lot of money from licensing that image. So the intangible element it was always and still remains to be in the control of the artist. What ARR changes is the suddenly the Andy Wall of the world, all those artists, something sometimes comes back into the picture when the physical object is being sold. Usually, we don't think that the control over the physical object is what copyright is all about. But ARR is. ARR is a control over the physical object. I get some right that intervenes in the sale of the physical object. So, as such, it seems like a right over tangible property and not over intangible property. And that matters. And again, that's not my field of expertise, but one of the ways that it matters is to say which government can get to control it. And we have that, by the way, in the United States too, but also in Canada, right? Uh, Different local government versus federal government, that jurisdiction partly determines whether we are regulating the physical object or we are regulating the intangible goods. So the argument is that if it regulates the tangible goods, maybe it shouldn't be controlled by the federal government, by the province. And that's the argument.
Yeah, no, some of those constitutional issues certainly have cropped up in a number of other copyright reforms in Canada over the years. And it's notable that it might here as well. Now, you've written about at least a couple of policy arguments that are often raised in favor of RRR. You characterize one as the starving artist rationale, and another as discrimination against visual artists rationale. And you've argued that both are unpersuasive. Can you explain?
Yeah. So the first one, as you said, is the starving artist rationale. And historically, that was the one. That was the one that we saw in France when those bills introduced. And interestingly enough, I'll tell you in a second, this is also sort of slightly falling out of favor in many places, but not in Canada. In that quote that you gave earlier from the Canadian government, that's the rationale that they're using, right? Artists are so poor, therefore we need to support them. That's the argument. There was this quote from Professor Monroe Prince, and this is a 1968 piece when he said, "Draw the suit, Artists Resale Right, is La Bohème reduced to statutory form, or Lust of Life," and he make fun of it. Like, you think about these artists, they are on the verge of starvation, and in the last penny, they create this work that almost killed them, and they sell it for nothing just to pay their rent, and then some semi-crook take this art and sell it for millions and not share it with the artist while the artist is still uh, dying. So it's a compelling story. The problem is that it's a story. And first of all, the idea that artists are poor in itself is not very clear that that's true at all. There are some studies, there are not a lot of studies about that, but some of them have come out, and some of them suggest that's just not the case. The thing is that if you look at the average art income of people who define themselves as visual artists, you do come up with a pretty low number. But if you control for age, suddenly it disappears because many of those people, I think intuitively, right? Many young people, they are, I don't know, 20 years old, 18 years old, 22 years old, and there are many people in that age that define themselves as artists and as visual artists or tried their luck being a visual artist. And, 3 years later, go do something else. So if you put them in the mix, yes, because generally speaking, 18-year-old, 20-year-old don't have a lot of income in any field. It doesn't matter if they're artists or not. So the argument of if you look at those artists, see how little they make, yeah, it's true, but they're young also, right? But if you control for age, suddenly you find that visual artists make roughly the same as other professions. So that's one issue. The second problem with that, and we can talk about it now or later, it's also if you really worried about how much artists make, this is like the worst thing you can do. This is just you're sending the money, and we can talk about it more later. The main beneficiary of this scheme are rich artists. So if you're starving artists is what you're worried about, it I don't want artists to starve. Fine, we can talk about how we can think about addressing that issue to the degree that we think that it's a serious issue. But resale royalties is not the way to do that. We are sending the money in the wrong place. So then, in recent years, and again, I didn't see it in the recent debate in Canada, there is another argument that says, well, the issue is not that visual artists are poor, the visually they are being discriminated against. So here's how the argument goes. If you look at non-visual artists, authors or movie producers or script writers, their income is different. Their income is usually spread over a long period of time. They get way less upfront, but as the money is being, the movie is being produced again, the script is being reused again, there is, the TV show is being broadcast again on reruns, they get a small royalty check in the mail, right? So the argument is, A, visual artists are discriminated and don't get it. And the second argument about that is saying, copyright, they don't really need copyright. And it's true, visual artists, for the most part, most of them don't need copyright because they sell the physical object, right? That's what we talked about. It's about physical object. So it's not okay. Why do those people get copyright to help them and we don't get copyright to help us? We should get something to that. But it's a fallacy. First of all, why is getting all the money up front necessarily a bad thing, right? If you get, I can get my money over a long period of time or upfront, and I don't know one is necessarily discriminatory compared to the other. Second, visual artists, many of them actually do generate income for a long period of time. They just sell more work. And sometimes they sell their old work. So many visual artists sell just a small portion of the work. And the rest is in a warehouse. So once they make it big, they can still continue, and they do, continue to sell it over a period of time if they want to. And if not, they can take their huge income up front and, use it as they want. And the argument about discrimination, about the copyright doesn't serve us, yeah, it doesn't serve you because you don't suffer from the same market failure that other artists suffer from. So if I write a book and I put it on the market without copyright, other people will basically steal my book, right? They might just make copies of my book and steal it. So I do need copyright to protect me. If I'm a successful visual artist, people can't make copies of my work because there are no substitute, right? I can easily make a copy of any Andy Warhol picture, of Picasso picture, but no one will pay me $5 million for my copy of Andy Warhol. So I don't need copyright. The Andy Warhol of the world, the Picasso of the world, all those successful artists, they don't need copyright. It's not discrimination. Other creators have a problem. Copyright solves their problem. Visual artists don't have the problem to begin with, so they don't use copyright. That's not, I don't call this discrimination. I just call a system that works differently, and I don't know why we should assume that it's not working.
Okay. It's interesting. It'll be interesting to see whether or not that latter rationale works its way into the Canadian policy discussion. Now you've mentioned Warhol, Picasso, and you did allude briefly to the notion of one of the concerns being around who the beneficiaries of ARR are. Can you tell us what the data and experience elsewhere tells us to date about who the major winners are for those that have implemented this kind of reform?
All right, this is in my mind maybe the most important argument, and that is that this is a very regressive scheme. So the idea there is that the main beneficiary of resale royalties are the rich. Okay, let's think about it rationally, and then I'll give some data. We said that it's mainly applied to auction houses, right? Sometimes to galleries. We said there is a threshold. You can't do it to, you can't have every work fall under it. We can talk about it. The administrative cost is just too high. So if I sell a piece of art for $100, the idea that now I need to deal with the bureaucracy of paying $5 to someone, no one wants that. So every country implemented a resale royalties scheme have a threshold. What that means, it's already filtered out the poor artists because they're under the threshold to only rich artists. So if you look at Sotheby's and Christie and all those auction houses, they mainly deal with very, very successful artists. Actually, they mostly deal with dead artists. Most of the work that's being sold in auction houses is work by dead artists, and usually very successful and very rich artists. So most of the income goes to them. Now, the people who support ARR will give you some data saying, look how many people get the money. And sometimes there is data about that. But what they sometimes don't tell us that most of those people get peanuts, get like $10 cents, $15 cents, $30 cents. The people who are the rich get thousands of dollars. So let me give you a few pieces of information. So there are a few studies about that, and won't be surprised to know that my favorite one is the one that I did. So Chris Prigman from NYU and I looked at it. It was in 2018, so 7 years ago. And what we looked at the time, one of the proposals, the United States was in that period, I told you, every like 10, 15 years, we think we want to do it and then decide not to do it. So this was our last time we thought about it was 2018. And we took the bill that was going through Congress and didn't go anywhere, said, let's assume it was in place. And we looked at the two big auction houses in the United States, Sotheby's and Christie's. And over a 2-month period, they said, okay, let's see what would happen to the market if the bill was enacted and was effective. And there was a few under transactions that would be subject to the bill, but it was extremely regressive. So here's a few things that we found. The most fun one, that 13%, so 1 in 7 of every dollar, so $1 out of $7 that goes would go to one person, and that is Andy Warhol. It actually would go to the Andy Warhol Foundation. So 13% of all the income that would have been generated from this scheme, if it were in place, would go to just one foundation. That's a very rich foundation. When Andy Warhol died, the value of his assets were around $200 to $300 million. That foundation sits on hundreds of millions of dollars. So that foundation would get 13% of the income. 57%, in our data, 57% of the income would go to dead artists. We'll talk later. That's actually a pretty low number. In other countries, the number is much lower. Only 43% goes to living artists. But even those living artists, almost all of them, if I would mention the name, every art lover would know them. Those are the most successful artists in the world. They are very old, right? Like the most successful one was Jasper Jones, who is about 90 years old. He's the most successful living artist in our scheme. Artists under 50, which are, if you think, those are the people we want to support, right? Artists under 50, and 50 is not that, I'm sorry to say, I mean, we are sort of, yeah, 50 is not that young anymore. But artists under 50 make 2.2%. So 2.2% of the royalty would go to artists under 50. And if you go under 30, it's basically nothing. It was, I think, like a few $1,000 for artists under 30. Research in other places found something somewhat similar, right? There is a research in the United Kingdom that found that 80% of the income goes to 100 artists, dead or alive. In France, there were several research. Some of them found that 50 artists control almost 50% of the income. And another one says that in 1 year, there were 7 families that got 70% of the income. That's crazy. However, if you look at that research, what about the 50% who are not the 50 big artists? And the argument is they get on average, 400 euros a year. That's not a lot, okay? Other study, in Germany, there was a study that found 88% of all the income goes to dead artists. In Denmark, 86% go to all dead artists. So we have a scheme here that, for the most part, transfer money to the families of very successful dead artists. That's usually left a nice amount to their family when they pass away. So those families, of course, are lobbying for those bills. The Picasso Foundation, the Warhol Foundation, all those, you see them all around the world. Those family of dead artists or living artists that are usually very old and very rich, really, really lobby. And they are very beloved, and rightly so, right? They earned it. But they are, in many, many countries, those are the people who really lobby for those initiatives.
Okay. I mean, that's interesting that this cuts across jurisdictions. So it's, it's not just the United States. I mean, your U.S. data is interesting, but it's notable that you're focused on the two biggest auction houses that, many people would associate with those kinds of artists. But it sounds like you're telling me that even when you get out of that bubble or out of that jurisdiction and you look elsewhere, that there are similar kinds of trends, which in some ways makes sense, that if you're talking about establishing thresholds and into sort of what's going to generate the most amount of money, it's going to come from the most established artists. And those are people who are going to be typically people who've been at it for a very long time or may no longer be at it because they've now died, but their work continues to live on.
Yeah. And it's unsolvable because you can't, first of all, those artists dominate the market. So any royalty scheme that is based on percentage of sale will compensate them, and you can't lower the threshold because the transaction cost will just make it unimaginable. So you can't just say every sale of art. The Sotheby's and the Christie's of the world can deal with the bureaucracy that entails that scheme. Once you start to go to smaller and smaller galleries, smaller and smaller sellers, just the technicalities of transferring the money will start to be more and more burdensome on them.
Okay. Now, with all of that, I mean, you've highlighted why it doesn't really achieve what most would want to see it achieved, or what the government would profess to say it wants to see achieved. But I think in some ways you've gone even further. You tried to argue that this actually undermines the economy and hurts artists. Can you talk
Yeah.
a bit about why you think that's the case?
Yeah. So part of it is it comes from what we talked about, right? We have a scheme here to transfer money to a very, very rich artist and their estate. So the first thing if we put our economists as for 1 second, said, where's this money coming from? Right? It needs to come from somewhere. And that is the concern, right? The concern is that this money would, for the most part, come from primary market. So if I'm buying art, one of the considerations I'm having when I decide how much to pay is how much I'm going to get at the back end. Now, of course, not everybody who buys art thinks that way. Some just say, I'm buying art because I think it's pretty and it'll be on my wall. But especially when we go to bigger and bigger sales, people have bigger and bigger concern about, okay, how much money am I going to make of it of the back end? Now, if we are sort of taxing it, it's a form of a tax, right, on the back end, then I'm willing to pay less on the front end. Now, that is very regressive because, as I said, on the back end, the main beneficiaries are the wealthy and the old and the dead. On the front end, it's not. In the primary market, actually, the gaps are much smaller. And young artists, that's where they're making their money, by the primary market. So any arm to the primary market is something we should be very concerned about. If our main concern is what do we do with poor artists, with young artists, with up and coming. But it's more than that. It's also will shrink the concern that it will shrink the auction market, which one thing it will move some of it from public auction to private sales, assuming that the private sales are not being burdened by that royalty scheme, which I don't know why that's good for us. It adds secrecy to the art market, which usually we don't think is a good thing. What it might be worse, it's moving from one country to another, right? And if I were in Canada, I would be quite concerned about that specifically. You have a very long border with the biggest art market in the world, right? The United States is the biggest art market in the world. I'm not sure that it's very difficult to move some sales from the Toronto and Montreal to Chicago and New York, right? So I would be concerned that, I mean, it's not that the market disappears, but some part of the market, some sellers will say, okay, I can sell it in New York and not pay royalties, or I can sell it in Toronto and pay royalties in New York, right? And that's not a good thing. Also, those auction houses and those markets create a lot of secondary benefits, right? And all those benefits, you want them in your country. You don't want to. I mean, I live south of the border, so I might benefit very indirectly from that. But as a country, you don't want that. Now, did it happen in the past? The evidence was not clear. There was some argument that the fact that France implemented before the United Kingdom move a lot of the art world, the center of the art world in Europe, from France to England. I will say I looked at that evidence. I think it's slightly anecdotal. I'm not sure that that's the only explanation, but that is the concern. And finally, uh, this system needs to be administered, right? We talked about the flow of the royalty and the transaction cost. Someone needs to do that. Someone needs to take that money from the auction house and go find the artist and write them checks. So there are collection societies that do that, but they take a part. They need to be paid. So those schemes, 10%, 15%, 20% of all that money is now going out of the art to basically administrators, who are basically glorified accountants, right? Who basically make sure that the money goes from the right pocket to the other pocket. And I'm not saying if they are doing it, they need to be paid. They don't should be expected to do that for free. But why is that good for the art world, right? Now money that was in the art world is now going outside of the art world. By the way, those organizations love ARR scheme and lobby for them everywhere in the world. In every country in the world, you see those organizations that are going to be paid because of that scheme lobby for that scheme.
Yeah. Well, no surprise about that. Certainly the
No.
role of collectives and the benefits of ever more collective systems when it comes to copyright and intellectual property related issues. We see that repeated again and again. Okay, well, you've made some strong cases highlighting this as I take notes here, a scheme largely for the wealthy, old, and dead, and highlighted
Yes.
the impact of shifting from, let's say, Canadian public sales to U.S. private sales, or just private sales potentially, and the impact that might have. Yet, despite those arguments, as we've been saying, these policies continue to surface or resurface depending on the jurisdiction. Are there better alternatives, do you think, or to conclude, is it simply your view that the market is sufficient here and it addresses the issue, and as you are successful and get older, you are likely to be compensated appropriately for your works?
Yeah, I mean those schemes are somewhat popular. There was a big push for them about a decade ago, and I don't. It didn't take over the world. Let's just say that many countries held back. Canada being one of them, at least back then. United States being another. Uh, I mean, it's a perfect storm, right? You have all those narratives about the starving artists, and you come all those old artists that are really beloved and say, "Hey, we deserve that. We was because we want to help the poor, but they are not helping the poor; they're helping themselves, and they have lobbying power." So I understand why it's happening. Uh, Now, is the market perfect? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I think it goes. The discussion underlines difficult question that each society and each of us have to ask ourselves. A society, basically, and that is what the value of the art, right? And I'll throw some ideas out there. This is not, I don't, you can't prove those things for the most part. Is whether art and the flourishing art market create valuable and meaningful externalities for society. If you think that the answer is yes, and I think many of us do, then I think it makes some sense that we should really, really care about the fact that we have a flow of art and that art is being supported. And we should really be concerned about the art market is already somewhat distorted, which even without ARR, we have a tiny group of that makes a lot of money, and we have a lot masses that do not. So that might not be ideal, right? That might not be ideal. That especially poor people might not even have the ability to hold back 10, 15 years until they try to make an income. So I think the underlying issue is how much should we have public support of the arts? Now, here's where I think it's to bring it to full circle. If we think as a society that we want to support art, and especially support young artists and not starving, but struggling artists, up and coming, ARR is like the worst thing you can do. Okay? But the other thing we can do, if we think it is valuable, right? Professor Brian Fry, offered a very simple solution. He said, you know, and he does not support ARR for the same reason roughly that we talked about here. But he said, if that's your concern, starving artists, fine. Take the royalties, but don't give them to the artists. Give it to some, foundations for the support of the art. Or create some channel that will channel that money to art school, like make art school cheaper. It may get that money not to the rich and wealthy and successful and usually dead. But if your concern is what do I do with the starving artist, then fine, take that money and put it to starving artists, right? Now again, I'm not sure that even that is justified to take the money out of the auction houses, because we talked about that in itself create issues. But certainly you really should not channel it like the ARR scheme do all of them to the wealthy. That is just a mistake. Now, again, you can think of many solutions. Either it comes from the general taxpayer money, or you want to tax the Sotheby's and the Christie's of the world. But I think any solution, if you think there is a problem, should channel the money somewhere completely different. Just the exact 180, the exact opposite of what ARR schemes do.
Okay. Well, we're about to have I think a debate on these issues in Canada. The government's committed to moving ahead with this. We don't have, as we've mentioned, the legislative language yet or the legislation. There was some thought it might appear in the Budget Implementation Act. It did not. So it is coming, although we don't know precisely when. And when it does, I know that this conversation is going to prove really useful for people, both to understand what's at stake and the prospect of doing exactly the opposite, as you suggested. So thank you for taking the time to join me on the podcast and for the work that you've done on this issue, which I will include in the show notes to this episode. So thanks again for joining me.
All right, thank you so much, Michael, and thank you for the podcast in general and for this talk.
That's the Law Bytes podcast for this week. If you have comments, suggestions, or other feedback, write to lawbytes@pobox.com. That's LAWBYTES @POBox.com. Follow the podcast on Twitter @LawBytesPod or follow Michael Geist @mgeist. You can download the latest episodes from my website at michaelgeist.ca or subscribe at iTunes, Google, or Spotify. The Law Bytes podcast is produced by Gerardo Lebron Laboy. Music by the Laboy brothers, Gerardo and Jose Lebron Laboy. Credit information for clips featured in this podcast can be found in the show notes at michaelgeist.ca. I'm Michael Geist. Thanks for listening and see you next time.